Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our Monash Partners webinar involving consumers in discovery research, reflections and learnings, and we're delighted to have Catherine Carmichael and Sarah Lukeman joining us today for our webinar. I'm Angela Jones from the Monash Partners team, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, in a spirit of reconciliation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to acknowledge and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Wherever you are, we acknowledge and pay respects to First Peoples. I'm joining you from the Monash Health campus in Clayton, Melbourne, and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm working today. I'll also invite you all to pop into the chat an acknowledgement of where you're joining us from today and the traditional owners of the land that you're working and living on. Before we get into our session, I know that we've got a number of researchers from laboratory and discovery-based research groups across the Monash Partners Network and beyond joining us today, so we welcome you all. And I just wanted to take a minute to highlight some of the resources that Monash Partners has. We prioritised consumer and community involvement in our strategic plan back in 2019, and we've been working on developing a better system for consumer and community involvement, and that includes resources that are freely available on our website. So this is a curated set of the frameworks, tools to support effective consumer and community involvement. There are a series of web-based modules on our website, and the website address is there, and we can pop that in the chat, but you might find those useful. Also, to highlight some additional consumer and community involvement training that's widely available as well. A program that's offered through the West Australian Health Translation Network. Consumer and community involvement in health research is a 30-minute, no-charge online module that's available and relevant to consumers, researchers, clinicians and health managers as well. And then an additional program which is run through the Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia, which is focused more on consumers, but is also free of charge. So we just highlight those as options if you're considering some resources to support you. The other program I'd like to highlight is that Monash Partners offers regular seminars in consumer and community involvement, and we've been doing this now since about 2021. All of our previous seminars are on our website along with the recordings, and so the seminars offer practical tips and suggestions from people who are leading consumer and community involvement in their research, so we'd encourage you to look at those at any time. The other aspect to our consumer and community involvement platform is that we provide as a team advice to research groups under the Monash Partners Network. So if you're interested in strengthening consumer and community involvement in your research program, or perhaps if you're writing a grant, a number of funding agencies now require consumer and community involvement. We are available to support you. There's a link there to the advice form, and we'll pop it in the chat also. Please reach out to us and we can link in with you and provide you with some support around developing the consumer and community involvement part of your application or strengthening that aspect of your research program. The other resource that I wanted to highlight to you today is a resource developed by our colleagues in Western Australia, the Western Australian Health Translation Network. One of the gaps was a practical how to do it guide to consumer and community involvement, and this resource was developed and takes stakeholders through the different phases of consumer and community involvement. It's been developed for health research organisations, consumers and funders and researchers. So it's available through the website, and the link is just there on the screen, and we'll also share that in the chat as well. These are our various comms channels. If you'd like to use those during the session and share your insights, that would be most welcome. I'm going to stop sharing now and introduce our speakers today, we're delighted to welcome Catherine Carmichael and Sarah Lukeman. Catherine is head of the Leukemia Modelling and Therapeutic Discovery Research Group within the Centre for Cancer Research at Hudson Institute, and she's also a Victorian Agency Mid-Career Research Fellow as well. Catherine is passionate about the opportunity to work with consumers, and today we'll be talking us through her experience of doing that and providing some of her reflections. And I'm also thrilled to welcome Sarah Lukeman. Sarah and Catherine have been working together in partnership for quite some time now. Sarah is a cancer survivor, clinical trial participant, and experienced health consumer advocate and representative. She's co-deputy chair of Cancer Voices New South Wales and has been on their executive committee going back to 2017 now. She's also a consumer buddy for a number of discovery science cancer research programs, both in New South Wales and Victoria, and is on the organising committee of the New South Wales Cancer Conference. Sarah and Catherine, a warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Apologies, trying to figure out how to unmute when I'm sharing my screen. Thank you, Angela, and thank you to you and Monash Partners for the opportunity to talk today about my experience working with consumers in discovery research. And thank you to Sarah for helping me out with this talk. And so what we're going to try and do is tag team this a little bit. So we've got slides that Sarah will talk to and slides that I will talk to. So hopefully that will flow quite nicely and not be too disjointed. So by way of introduction, I just wanted to briefly describe what we do in the lab. So we are a discovery research based lab focusing on understanding the mechanisms of acute myeloid leukemia, which is a very aggressive and often poor outcome subtype of blood cancer. And so we aim to work at all stages of this sort of translational pipeline, starting with very much discovery research, developing leukemia models in the lab that we can then utilise to discover key mechanisms that drive the disease development, with the hope of identifying unique leukemia-specific weaknesses or dependencies that we can then target therapeutically, with the ultimate goal of identifying and developing therapies that are less toxic to the patient and more toxic to the leukemia cells specifically, and ultimately hope to translate any of our findings to the clinic. But for the purposes of what we're doing at the moment, it's largely discovery-based research down at the early stages of this pipeline. So my consumer engagement journey, so what I'm going to do today is really just talk through my journey, which began in 2019, and really was, I think, the way a lot of discovery researchers start their consumer engagement journey is with the realisation that I needed to engage with consumers to get some grant funding. And so in 2019, that specifically was the Victorian Cancer Agency Mid-Career Research Fellowship. And I went to look to apply for that in early 2019 and saw that the eligibility requirements for the VCA at that time was they required researchers to actively involve consumers and the community in their research. And at that point, I had no idea what that was about or what consumer involvement meant. So then I sort of was hit with these 4 key questions, which I imagine a lot of researchers have at some stage in their consumer engagement journey. And the 4 questions really that I had at the time were, who actually is a consumer? So who is a consumer for my research? How do I find a consumer and connect with one? How do I work with the consumer, and how on earth can they help me with my research? And I think a lot of researchers, particularly discovery researchers, have that 4th question in their mind. Is like, what can a consumer do for my research? They aren't scientists. They can't help me design my experiments, analyze my data. And so that was a key question. And I hope that I can provide some of my learnings about that to you today. So I think I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, because the best person to talk about who actually is a consumer herself. So Sarah, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. So who is a consumer? In some respects, we are all health consumers. We all have a unique cancer story. Well, not even cancer, sorry, but a unique health story, sorry. But in particular reference to a health consumer, unlike clinicians and researchers who study hard to become experts in your field, the health consumers are experts by experience. And they're wearing a different hat. They have a different perspective that they bring to your work. And it includes carers and family members. It's not just patients. And it doesn't have to be a trauma or a negative experience. It could be a positive one. And they also have a whole of life experience that they can contribute, not just their disease. But of course, everybody obviously has different experiences they bring. So ideally, and this is a requirement more and more, ideally you're engaging with multiple consumers, which provides a diversity of perspectives. And it's best to have a consumer who is connected, has a network, so they're able to represent a group and are not isolated and just giving their own experience. But that's something that you can assist your consumer with. If you know somebody who's a good consumer, you can help connect them with the wider community. So how did I become a health consumer in research? It started back in 2006. My family was living in Carnarvon, my husband, my daughter Hannah, who was 6, and Katrina, who was 4. We're in Carnarvon, which is 900 kilometres north of Perth. I had strange blood results and I was sent to Perth to see a haematologist. So that was a 3-day round trip because there was only one flight a day out of Carnarvon. So I headed down there by myself, saw the haematologist on a Thursday, had a bone marrow biopsy to rule out anything nasty, and went back to see him at 2 o'clock on the Friday afternoon with the hopes of everything being okay and I could head home on the Saturday. But that wasn't to be. I was told that I had acute promyelocytic leukemia, which is a very rare form of acute myeloid leukemia, or AML. So I was very lucky. I qualified for a clinical trial and there was a bed waiting for me at Royal Perth Hospital. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was in there and I started chemo that night. I was in Royal Perth Hospital for 6 weeks and for the induction phase of my trial. And towards the end of that, I went into septic shock and had one-on-one nursing for a couple of days. So that first photo, I'm very well, feeling fine, thinking, you know, surely you've got the wrong person, nothing wrong with me. The second photo, I'm in the backyard of a townhouse that the Leukemia Foundation provided to the family to live in Perth whilst I was having my treatment. And that second photo, I'd finished my induction phase. I didn't actually get back to Carnarvon for 3 months. I had 2 consolidation phases after the induction phase, and that was very intense. So we were 5 months in Perth living in that townhouse. And my parents and my in-laws took it in turns coming over from the East Coast to look after the girls because I was unable to take them to school, go grocery shopping, do anything like that. Next slide, Catherine. So by September 2006, my husband's 40th birthday, I was in molecular complete remission. The clinical trial was a great success. I'd finished the induction and consolidation phases and I'd had stem cells harvested in case of relapse in the future. All I had now was 2 years of maintenance therapy, which I thought would be a breeze because it was just tablets. But unfortunately that wasn't to be. I found them quite hard to tolerate. But by October of 2008, it was all finished. I'm flying off to Abu Dhabi, Egypt and Jordan. That's one of my sisters, Nicola, to celebrate my 40th birthday. And then just after that, in November of 2008, my friend Jo, who's, oh, just back one, sorry, my friend Jo, who's in the middle photo there, she was over visiting from Sydney during 2007. She had 12-hour emergency surgery for ovarian cancer. And she lived with that for just over 6 years. So it didn't seem fair that our friend group had, you know, so many cancer journeys. You know, me getting cancer didn't stop her getting it, which was quite hard to deal with. So although my treatment finished, it wasn't actually the end of my cancer journey. Next slide now, thanks, Catherine. Sorry, I need to get down. So like a lot of cancer survivors, I tried to use my story. I got involved with fundraising, did lots of different things. 2011, our family moved to the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. In 2012, the results of my clinical trial were published in the Blood Journal, and that was very exciting to see. I thought I could do more than fundraising. I'm not a natural fundraiser. It didn't really satisfy me. So in 2014, I did advocacy training with Cancer Council New South Wales and actually discovered this thing called consumer involvement in research. I thought, oh, I think I can add something to that. I think that might be what I can do. So I did training in that in 2016 and joined Cancer Voices New South Wales, as was mentioned in the introduction. And since then, I was partnered with a number of discovery science researchers at Newcastle Uni and the cancer service providers in the Hunter New England Local Health District. And then in 2019, Cancer Voices connected me with Catherine, who'd sent through a request. And Catherine can fill you in on that little bit, but that started our relationship. And then in 2020, just before COVID, what had been totally volunteer unpaid experience and work at that point in time became paid a couple of days a week. I started working for the Hunter Cancer Research Alliance in Newcastle, and for 2 years I managed over 30 consumers on their consumer panel and 200 researchers, and really grew my expertise in consumer involvement in research. I've had lots of other things since then, but in the interest of time, I'll push on to the next slide, which is just to remind everybody that a consumer brings a lived experience to your research, but they're a lot more than just that diagnosis. So the reason I felt particularly qualified, or that consumer involvement in research resonated with me, is that I was a chemical engineer. I'd study at Sydney Uni and worked for 10 years in the mining industry. And 4 of those were in corporate research, and 4 in safety, environment and quality programs. I did lots of auditing against ISO standards in safety, health, quality and environment on mining sites. So I had a strong STEM background. I really support women in STEM. I also had 5 years on Singleton Council as an elected local government representative. So I know a lot about governance, sitting on boards and committees, and I'm a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, so I have qualifications as a board director. And I've lived regionally most of my life, and am an active member of the Country Women's Association. So there's a lot of experiences that I can bring with me, as well as my lived experience as a cancer survivor. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Sarah. So the next question that I had on my consumer engagement journey was, how do I find a consumer? I need to connect with one. How on earth do I find one? And so at that time in 2019, I was working in the Central Clinical School of Monash University, and I was asking all my colleagues, what is a consumer? How do I find a consumer? And pretty much the answer from everyone was, I don't know. I have no idea. So that wasn't much help. But eventually I did find someone who was able to direct me towards the Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group, or ALLG, which runs clinical trials and research in blood cancer and in lymphoma in Australia. And they were able to put me in contact with the consumer. And they also suggested Cancer Voices New South Wales. And that's, as Sarah mentioned, how I got in contact with Sarah. And they have an online form that can be completed requesting consumer representative, that you fill in details related to what you need, what project, what research you're doing, what kind of involvement is required and that sort of thing. And they aim to put you in contact in the cancer space, obviously only, with consumers with a lived experience. So that was how I connected with Sarah, and that has been an amazing connection. So Sarah has taught me so much in this space, not only about her lived experience with AML, but also about consumer involvement. You can see from what she's spoken about how much experience and knowledge she has in that area, and she's really helped me to learn and become a better at engaging with consumers and understanding the value. Since then, I've learned there are a number of other ways of finding and connecting with consumers, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things that I know about, or ways that you can find consumers. So patient support groups and networks can be approached with a request for someone who might be interested in doing consumer engagement or working with a research partner. Health services, hospitals, clinicians, all potentially can put you in contact with potential consumers. Social media, of course, lots of support groups have Facebook pages and then Twitter accounts, and you can reach out that way as well. Large community groups can also be contacted for with requests related to a particular health condition that you might be researching. Monash Partners has a wealth of information on their website and are also available to assist in this. Health Issues Centre is another one. But what I want to spend the next slide on is institute-driven consumer engagement programs. And I really think that this is key for researchers to be able to engage effectively and respectfully and appropriately and sustainably with consumers, is if there is an institute or university-driven consumer engagement program that can assist with that process. And in 2019, when I was trying to engage with consumers, the CCS and Monash University did not have a consumer engagement program or anyone employed in that capacity. And so given my experience and talking to Sarah and talking to Katja Gray at WeHi, runs the WeHi Consumer Buddy program, and George, who is part of that, they provided me with a lot of information and resources, and I decided with a group of other like-minded researchers within the Central Clinical School, many of which are shown here, but not all, we decided to put together our own program, which we call the Community and Researcher Engagement or CARE program, which is now broadly available through the Central Clinical School. And so this program, we also had two amazing consumer and patient advocates, Anna and Ken, shown down here in the bottom, who have been amazing as well. They were part of the committee from the very beginning in 2020 when we started this program, and they were amazing and continue to be amazing in helping us develop and run that program. And so this program, which has only been running for 2 years, from 2021, early 2021 to now, 2 and a bit years, has over 50 consumers on their registry and nearly 30 researchers connected into the program. And so that, through setting that program up and being involved in helping to set up and run it, I've learned so much as well about consumer engagement. And I thank Sarah as well, because she was involved in guiding us as well for that program. But I really do emphasise that the need for these programs within institutes and universities or people employed in the capacity to help researchers to do effective consumer engagement, because it isn't something that is easy to do yourself without some support and assistance, not to do well anyway. So the third question on my list was, how do I work with the consumer? What do I do? How does a consumer engage with me? And I'm going to hand over to Sarah again to talk about her experience working as a consumer in research, but also her experience as a consumer engagement coordinator with the Hunter Cancer Research Alliance. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Catherine. So this is a little, unfortunately, terminology is a big issue. What one person thinks of as consumer involvement might be different to somebody else. So I like to just share this this slide and a way to think about consumer involvement, just to help clarify the different roles that consumers can play. So the first one is participation. So there's participation, involvement and engagement, or PI. People who participate in a clinical trial are generally called participants. And I think the easiest thing is to avoid in discovery science referring to consumers as participants, because it gets confusing with clinical trialists. So you can have a participant in a clinical trial. Engagement tends to be one way. You can send information newsletters. You might make a presentation to a local community group like Rotary or something. Share your findings to the wider community. You're engaging with the community, but they're not necessarily giving you a lot of information back. Involving consumers or the community in your research, however, is a lot more dynamic and two-way. There's more sharing of power between the two bodies. And it's, as it says, consumers and community working alongside health professionals and researchers. So I prefer to use the word consumer involvement in research rather than engagement. And you need to engage as well. It's not that one's wrong or one, and but they're just different. The really important thing is participants in clinical trials, any clinical trials, requires ethics approval. So Human Research Ethics Committee approval. You do not need ethics approval to involve consumers in your research as a discovery science researcher. So keep away from the words participation in research, and you should avoid any quagmire of getting stuck down in semantics about having to get ethics approval. So that's my first tip for you. My next slide is just a bit more on that. So what is and isn't consumer involvement in research? So good consumer involvement is about establishing and building good relationships. And like any relationship, be it with your parents or your partner, this takes time and it does take some resources. So, and as I also mentioned, it requires a sharing of power and a shared purpose. It's about doing projects with consumers rather than, or even by consumers, which is consumer-led research, rather than to or about them. It's not passive one-way interaction, and it is definitely not just sticking a consumer's name on a grant application, which is often where people start, but hopefully that's just the start of that relationship and you can go on to build something bigger. How can consumers be involved? Where do you involve them? Ideally, you involve them throughout the whole research cycle. So have consumers there right at the start, like another team member. You may have a pathologist or a statistician or a clinician involved. Consult with the end user about the research questions and make sure that the anticipated benefits are actually of value to them. It can really help focus where you are driving your research to talk to the end users right at the beginning before you even start your grant applications. Then deciding how to do the research. There might be some patient-reported measures that you can use. There's probably less involvement there for discovery science than, say, clinical trials where consumers can be involved with recruitment processes and all patient-facing documents. Doing the research, really there's not a lot that consumers can do in terms of, we're not going to come into your lab and do the research for you. That's your expertise. But you can share your results along the way and let your consumers know how the results are going. It may be only every 6 months that you catch up. Research is a long process, we understand that. But the other area that you can really involve consumers, is in what next, the so what. So we've had this result, what are we going to do with that now? What's the next phase going to be? When I was working at HCRA, I did a survey at the end of my 2 years, and we had over 30 consumers and 200 researchers that were involved. And I provided a matching service from consumers to researchers. So researchers would send through a request. But I also provided mentoring and training to both the consumers and researchers on how to work together and get the best out of that relationship. At the end of my time with HCRA, which closed up due to funding finishing, we did a bit of a survey to measure the impact of the consumer panel activities and support that I'd provided. So we had 22 researchers who'd been involved with the CAP, so 50% of the people that I sent the survey out to who responded. Almost half of the people who responded to this survey were actually discovery science researchers, and 70% of them were early or mid-career researchers as well. So if you're starting out not knowing what to do, you're not alone. And there are other discovery science researchers like Catherine who are engaging with consumers. And this is where the researchers thought that they had involved consumers in their in the cycle of their research. Not surprising to me that the highest involvement was with funding, and most of that was feedback on grant applications, but some consumers were listed as associate investigators, and one was even as a co-investigator. But then as we get to the later phases of the research cycle, there was a lot lower participation at communicating outcomes and developing future steps or translating into change practices. Interestingly, we asked the consumers the same question, and they were only at about 20%. They felt only 20% of them had been involved with communicating the outcomes and translating into the next phase. And I think that's a really lost opportunity to really use your consumers to disseminate the results of your research. Just seen the time, we need to push on. In terms of the sort of work that they do, a lot of the times, up to 50%, is just a one-off interaction. So it might be looking at a survey and giving feedback on it. But a lot of them, as you can see, have had a number of years where they've been working with consumers. I did ask the consumers what sort of acknowledgement they had received from the researchers. And there was, unfortunately, a lot who said that they had had really no acknowledgement. And particularly, I wanted to highlight the advising of funding outcomes. So only 30% there, or just over 30%, had actually been contacted by the researcher and been told whether the grant was successful or not. And that's just to remind you that the consumer isn't actually involved with the whole research cycle. Other people who are AIs or CIs on your grant application understand the grant process and are hooked into it. But a consumer may not be working with anybody else, and just reach out to them, say, oh, unfortunately, we were unsuccessful with that grant, because they just assume it was unsuccessful if they haven't heard from you. So what have I actually done as a consumer involved with research? And this is focusing on the basic science or discovery science. So I have had input to grant applications. I attend lab meetings, and as I say, not very regularly, but come in. And I'm actually at Monash Uni with Catherine today and going to go around her lab this afternoon. I've sat on grant and PhD selection panels. I've been a consumer representative on local health district cancer committees. I am named associate investigator on a number of different grant applications, including Catherine's. None of which have been successful yet, but fingers crossed, we've got a few in the works. I've been in promotional material for funding organisations, and as was mentioned, on symposium and conference committees. So I will hand back to Catherine.
Thank you, Sarah. So what I'll do now is the next couple of slides, I'm just going to go through the types of examples of what myself and my lab do with Sarah and our other consumer partners, and things that can be done in the discovery research aspect of consumer involvement and engagement. So one of the first and most important things is to meet with the consumer when you first connect with them, and ideally in person if you can, but most of my consumer partners live out of state, so it's often by Zoom. But I did get to meet Sarah for a coffee and chat a couple of times, and she's here visiting Victoria at the moment, and so it's lovely to have her visit the Hudson Institute for the first time and look around our lab. But when you first connect with the consumer, it's really important to just sit and have a chat and get to know them, learn about their lived experience. As Sarah's touched on, it's a very unique perspective on the disease and health condition that we as researchers thankfully and luckily don't have that perspective, and it really can open our minds to a different way of viewing what we do in the research space. And consumers are often very knowledgeable, if not the most knowledgeable in their own disease area. They've spent a long time thinking about the disease, experiencing the condition, researching it online, talking to clinicians, health services and other things. And so they bring a lot of information to the table that we wouldn't necessarily know as researchers or have thought about before. And as part of that discussion, we always discuss the opinions of the consumers on what they think are the critical areas for improvement, because what the patients believe or the carers or family members believe are the most important areas may not be what we as researchers think are the most important areas. Often they align, but not always. Where possible, we invite consumers to our lab meetings, usually only a couple of times a year, just for an update and to meet new staff or students in the lab. So this is usually by Zoom, and I think this is really important because it allows the students and early career researchers in the lab to talk about their work in lay terms, to be able to step back from the minutiae and the very focused research that they do in the lab, to think more broadly about the goals and the aims of their work and why they're doing what they're doing and what they hope to achieve. So they can step back and think about it in those terms and explain what they're doing to a layperson. And that's a really important communication skill that all researchers should develop. And I think consumers are perfect for helping with that. In our lab meetings, when we have consumers visit, we talk about our overarching research goals. So again, stepping back to think more broadly about what we hope to achieve, and allows the consumer to ask us questions about what we're doing, which again can crystallize some different thoughts or different ideas in our minds when we hear how the consumer is viewing what we're doing and the questions and ideas that they might have. And it's always great to hear from the consumer how they think our research might impact patients, because ultimately, even at the discovery research phase, we're hoping to ultimately generate research that will assist with improving the quality of life or the treatment for patients in the end. Where possible, we invite our consumer partners in to visit and tour the lab. Most consumers are not scientists, and they are very keen to see how research is done in the laboratory. And I think this really helps them to understand what we do, understand why it takes so long for research, from discovery research through to the clinic, why research does take quite a long time to develop, and also helps them to understand why it's such an expensive thing to do research, why we need continual funding to do what we do. Grant applications are another really important area where we utilise the expertise of our consumer partners. So we share our grant applications with them. We ask them to be AIs, associate investigators, on the applications, as Sarah mentioned, and ask them to provide feedback on the project. And this is particularly useful for lay summaries, consumer panel forms for grants that require consumer involvement. They usually will have a consumer panel that reviews the grant, or a particular form that the consumer panel will review. So knowing how to write that to really impact a consumer is really important. Talking to the consumer and having them provide feedback on your grant applications really helps us to develop our impact statements and our significance statements. So, because again, it helps us to think about the impact and significance in a different way, which helps us to then put it down on paper in a different way, which is often more impactful and more significant than what it may have been before. And we hope to empower our consumer partners with information so that they can take our research success stories back to their communities, their networks, and share what we do. So not just our success stories, but just what we do in general, but also if we have significant research findings, publications, or funding successes, we ask that our consumers share that with their own networks. We provide them with the information in a way that they can understand, that allows them to then take that information and share it around. And I think that's really important for discovery research to be more widely understood and digestible within the community, so that the community knows more about what we're doing, and consumers are a really valuable part of that. They can really share that, and they're often very well connected through patient support groups, Facebook groups, disease-specific associations. So they really do often have great networks that they can share our information through. And so the last question for this slide, and is a tricky question that a lot of discovery researchers struggle with, and is how can a consumer help with my research? And I think I've touched on that with the how do I work with the consumer slides, but these are sort of some of the key areas that I see consumer engagement and involvement really helping with my research. So they really, understanding that lived experience and that unique patient perspective does really enhance our research, because we think about it in a different way. We think about what we're hoping to achieve in a different way, and it puts a different information that we don't really necessarily think about when we're planning our research. It provides motivation for everyone in the lab, students, early career researchers, mid-career researchers, group leaders like myself and beyond. And I've said this a number of times, that I worked in acute myeloid leukemia research for 14 years before I ever met someone who had been diagnosed with AML or been touched in any way by leukemia. And now I think about that, I think that's ludicrous that I would work on a disease and never have met someone who actually had experience with that. And so now I've met a number of blood cancer consumers, and they're all amazing, and I've learned so much from all of them. And it's really motivating for me. And I think some of my students in the past have told me that it's been motivating to them to hear the stories from the consumers. Again, understanding that patient experience and identifying patient-led priorities for research helps, again, to boost the significance and impact of our research programs. Factoring that information in really helps us to design and develop programs that are more significant and impactful. And it also ensures that there's improved transparency about how we are doing research and how we're using public money to do research, if we're involving the community and consumers in developing the research goals and objectives. As I've said on the previous slide, just that consumers can help disseminate our research findings to the community, help raise awareness of research outcomes, and they can be members within institutes and universities on internal grant review panels or PhD student panels. And I'll speed up because we are running out of time. But from a funding perspective, of course, everyone knows that consumer involvement is increasingly required for grant applications. But in addition to that, they do help with the development of the significance and impact statements, the lay summaries, the design of the project. And they're often, a lot of consumers are sitting on these grant funding committees and reviewing the grants. So they can provide, obviously they'll be conflicted on our own grants, but they can provide insight into how the grants are seen by consumers and how best to write them. And this is, a key unasked question that didn't occur to me for quite a long time, which is, how can a consumer benefit from engaging with me? And I think we all think about what they can do for us, but not what we do for them and why they would want to do this in the first place. And so talking to a number of consumers over the last few years, these are one of the key things that I've heard. For them, it's an opportunity to give back to medical research community. They've often benefited from medical research in the treatment, in the cure, in their quality of life has benefited because of medical research. They want to contribute back to that. They've had a very unique and often long and difficult journey. And so it's they like to be able to have that experience and opinion heard and valued. And it is an expert opinion that we can't understand or can't experience ourselves. And they're often, as I said, the most educated person on the disease or treatment. So it's good for them to be able to give that back to us. It gives them a sense of purpose, keeps them motivated in their own disease journey, provides optimism, particularly for those living either with chronic side effects of their treatment or living with a chronic disease that has no cure. Allows them to stay informed of up-to-date research, which for a lot of consumers is really important. They want to know what's going on and stay up to date with that. And it helps them to advocate for others who are unable to do so, particularly consumers that have gone through their experience and come out the other end, like Sarah. They can advocate and help for improved patient care for those coming behind, those are currently going through the experience or will in the future. An amazing consumer and patient advocate, Anna, who's been involved with the care program since it started and has, I'm excited to say, recently joined our lab as a consumer partner, says a very important, rewarding and positive element of her life is advocacy, volunteering and fundraising for research support and prevention of cancer.
And shout out to Anna, who's online. So thanks for joining us, and all the other consumers. I can see a few of you in the participants. This is just, again, that survey that I did of the 33 consumer members. We had a 50% response rate. And this is just backing up basically what Catherine just said. So a lot of personal benefit to consumers for being involved with research. And down the bottom there, contributing to cancer research is the biggest one. Learning about breakthroughs, interacting with researchers, being a valued member of the team is something that you may not think about, but often health, particular cancer, can be quite isolating. The treatment, you're immunocompromised a lot of the time. your life is sort of turned upside down. You never actually go back. I mean, for me, I never went back to what I was doing beforehand. And so it's sort of, it gives you something else to do, which is great. And using my lived experience with cancer for something positive was down about number 5 of the main benefits. And the next slide, somebody in the questions did ask about compensation or reimbursement. And because there was a lot of consumer involvement in discovery science from these consumers at HCRA, there wasn't a lot of a lot of compensation paid. There was a small amount of reimbursement or expenses being paid. There was training provided, and obviously I provided a networking support. But you can see down the bottom there, and I think this is worth pointing out, that there are a few who were offered money and just didn't want to take it. I know a lot of people, a lot of cancer consumers would rather the money that goes into the research, but the problem with that is diversity. If you are only having consumers who can afford to not be paid, you are actually cutting out a large part of the general community. So that's something to think about. And I must say, since we did this survey, there has been a lot of changes. New South Wales Health has got compensation rates that have come out, Health Consumers New South Wales, and I know Monash Partners have guides as well. So there is guidance on reimbursement. It's not always possible, particularly with discovery science. The important thing is to be upfront. If you can't pay, say that you can't pay. But if you can organise parking, provide your consumer with some refreshments, a glass of water, whatever, they may have taken a bit of time to get there. Catherine's always, I mean, I've only been down to Melbourne twice with COVID, but, you know, assists when she does put in grants. She ensures that there's a little bit of funding in there so that I can be flowing down once a year to have that face-to-face. We do a lot of Zooming, but face-to-face is really important. So it's not necessarily a lot of money, but your consumers shouldn't be paying to be involved in your research. And just to flip that, the researchers, we asked them a lot about the burdens, the extra workload of involving consumers and the benefits. And then we just asked the simple question, you know, on the balance, was it worth it? And this is, I think, just speaks volumes. So yes, give it a go, just do it.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll just quickly fly through. I've just got a couple more slides to go. Challenges and highlights, I think, is an important slide too. For me, at least, these are some of the challenges that I've come across. I think finding the time to meet and maintain the relationship is challenging across distance, different locations, time constraints, everyone's busy. But it really is about maintaining a relationship. If you can't meet with them, just drop them an email to say something's come up. Sorry, I haven't been in contact for a while. Just the common decency of a relationship. It is a relationship, a friendship, a connection. So just maintaining that relationship is a challenge, but is really worthwhile and important to do. For me, being organised enough in my grant writing is a real challenge to be able to give the consumer sufficient time to provide feedback. Giving it to them 2 days before is not appropriate. Generally, I'm not finished until 2 days before or the day of, but working to be a bit more organised so that I can give my consumer time to provide valuable feedback is a challenge. That's something I'm working on. Finding appropriate consumers at the start is important and can be a challenge. So consumers that have the experience, knowledge, interest, enthusiasm and willingness to be involved. And often finding trained consumers is very difficult because they're very much needed and utilised. So with the CARE program, we're very focused on finding consumers that haven't worked as a consumer or patient advocate before and training them up so that we can expand the amount of trained consumers available. But finding an appropriate consumer can be challenging. And knowing how to engage effectively with consumers and get the most out of the partnership is a challenge. And I hope that some of what Sarah and I have talked about today will help you understand better what is involved. But there's definitely been lots of highlights, just a few listed here: meeting new people with completely different backgrounds. I've never met a chemical engineer or someone who's worked in the mining industry before. It's been fascinating talking to Sarah about her life experiences. And she has great knowledge in different areas, and the other consumers that I've met all have different life experiences. That's really been enlightening for me. Having my mind opened and expanded and viewing my research through a completely different lens has been a real highlight. Developing the CARE program was really was hard work, but it's been really a really fantastic journey for me and the others that were involved. And I continue to really enjoy helping to educate and guide others on their consumer engagement journey. And I think I definitely have an enhanced motivation and drive to succeed in my research after having spoken with a number of blood cancer consumers over the last 4 years. So key take-home messages for researchers: connect with consumers early and really go into it with an open mind. You might have a lot of questions and a lot of queries about how this might work, but open your mind and give it a try, because it really is very valuable. It's important, I think, to identify the type of consumer engagement that you want, need, and are comfortable with on both sides. Do you only want a single consumer that's going to have significant engagement? Do you want multiple consumers with less engagement, or do you want a large group of consumer advisors and you'll only engage with those that you need when needed? So understanding that at the start and communicating that to your consumers is important. There's no specific formula as far as I'm concerned for effective consumer engagement. You just need to work out what works best for you and the consumers that you partner with, and just really important to maintain that open dialogue and manage or discuss expectations early on so that everyone knows where they are sitting on the page and how it's going to work. And I like this lived experience expert terminology as opposed to consumer. I think that's really important because they are an expert in their lived experience and they should be treated as such. Be respectful of consumers and their time, always be courteous and professional. As I said, it's a relationship, a friendship, so treat them appropriately. And as Angela touched on at the start, there's a lot of training becoming available, so I really encourage anyone to do a training if they can find training online or in person. That's really important.
And my final slide is much the same things as that we've already covered. So decide what experience and skills would assist you, and right at the beginning, the ARA resources, they have an expression of interest template that you could use. So I'd highly recommend you look at that. You need to devote the time and resources like any relationship. Discuss your expectations, both yours and the consumers, on how often you'll meet and what the workload might be over the year or over the 3 years of the project, and it is likely to vary. Provide an induction. So please, give them an organisation structure with the names and titles. I've sat in meetings where everybody's known each other and I have had no idea who everybody else is because they all work together and I haven't. Introduce them to your research team, give them a lab tour if you can, even if it's just a bunch of equipment and you think it's really boring, nothing to see. I can assure you that won't be the case. And if there is an admin support person who's going to be contacting them in terms of parking and stuff, introduce them to that person and provide the contact details. Get rid of your TLAs and use your plain language. And if you don't understand my TLA, that's a 3-letter acronym, and a consumer can really help that. Provide support and training, and that's to consumers and also research staff for anybody who's involved at an organisation level. And as we've mentioned, recognise expert skills and knowledge of the patient experience. So reimburse at a minimum if you can, and remunerate if possible. Consumers don't do it to be rich, but try to ensure that they're not out of pocket, and don't underestimate the benefit to both you and the consumer. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And just to acknowledge everyone involved. So my 4 consumer partners, Sarah, Anna, Rob and Belinda. Carter and George, as I mentioned, were really important early on with the CARE program and giving us a lot of advice and help there. And then everyone, past and present members of the CARE team, in particular bolded there, Karen Alt, who was as passionate as I was about setting this program up and continues to run the program. Ange Bishop, who's our amazing consumer engagement coordinator that the Central Clinical School and Alfred Foundation co-fund her position. We would be lost without, or the program would be lost without her. And Ken and Anna, who were very important and continue to be important in guiding that from a consumer perspective. And I'm funded by the Victorian Cancer Agency. I finally did get a mid-career research fellowship last year after 3 attempts, and the NHMRC. Thanks.
Catherine and Sarah, thank you so much for an inspiring presentation and just sharing with us how you've worked together, and your insights, I think, have been terrific. I'm going to invite Sandy Reader to join me. We've got a few minutes left and we've had a couple of questions that have come through the chat and the Q&A. We thought we might just in the time left just try and address a couple of them. You've spoken to aspects of some of them in your presentation. There's a question there about compensating consumers for their time, and I think you've in the chat we've highlighted some of the policies that are relevant in this space, but also I guess just a couple of learnings Sandy and I have had from a Monash Partners standpoint is that there really does need to be a dedicated resource that the consumer has as a kind of a go-to. I think, Sarah, would you say that? So obviously you work very closely with Catherine for, in other instances, consumers might be supporting a project team or a larger initiative. And so it's less a one-on-one type relationship. But I think those people to provide that support and outreach and to keep that communication even in between of regular scheduled meetings, we feel is really vital in terms of developing the relationship and the trust, which is so important to everything that we do. And I think your presentation has highlighted that beautifully around you've developed how you've worked together over time in a very respectful way, respectful of each other's expertise, Catherine's scientific expertise, and Sarah, your expertise as someone with a lived experience of cancer, but also many other life experiences and skills that you bring to the role as well. Sandy, was there anything that you also wanted to just reflect on there?
No, I think you've reiterated everything beautifully. Wonderful presentation. And the original question back to the reimbursement, just using the guides that come from, known reputable places. So we've highlighted some and some others have also highlighted others.
And sorry, Sarah. I was just going to say, for the researchers, including that budget line in your grant applications is the easiest and best way. So I have a budget line in my Victorian Cancer Agency mid-career fellowship to support flying Sarah and other out-of-state consumers down to Melbourne once a year and providing that reimbursement and cab charges if they're travelling by public transport, taking them out for coffee or lunch, that sort of thing. It's not a lot of money in the scheme of things, and it's just very easy to add that into your grant application as a budget line.
And having sat on panels on the other end, people can say, oh yes, we have consumer involvement, but then if there's no budget for it, I really do question it. So, I would highly recommend you do it. It's not a lot of money. A lot of people are quite happy to not take payment, but you need to have that conversation and how you do the payment as well. There was one question that I saw, and apologies if I've missed others, about doctors asking patients to be a consumer and that power imbalance. And I think it's worth just saying that I could not have been a health consumer on the particular clinical trial I was on. If you are a participant on that trial, you can't be the health consumer. But there's no reason that I couldn't have, after being on that trial, gotten involved with the next steps of that project, using that, really high knowledge of that trial, of what it was like to live through it. So it's all about where and when. When I was on the consumer advisory panel, we had a number of oncologists who, particularly when their patients had finished their active treatment, they were in a monitoring thing, he'd let them know about the HCRA Consumer Advisory Panel and say they might be interested in putting in an application or expression of interest form to join that panel. So there were a number of consumers who joined that way. So so clinicians are a good way, are a good sort of conduit, they have a relationship with that person, but yes, they can't necessarily, the person couldn't be the researcher, couldn't be the consumer on research they're doing themselves. So, if you've got relationship with clinicians, they are a good source. And, Cancer Voices New South Wales has consumer involvement in research, over 100 consumers. If you have a consumer who, if you're working in cancer, suggest that they join, because that network and support is really good. And as I mentioned before, the various state-based bodies and Consumers Health Forum Australia.
And you make, just with, obviously you'd want a clinician-patient relationship to have also moved into a different phase or stage. Just to add what to the good words you've said there, Sarah.
Yeah, and somebody's just put in about strategy. I was actually, the reason I started working with HCRA in 2020 was they put like this, they'd advertised to their consumer body, the panel that I was on, that they were redoing their strategy. And so I put my hand up, said, oh, I'm really interested in strategy. I had expertise there. So I was actually involved in their developing their strategy for the next phase. And that was sort of how I ended up working for them. I think you need consumers involved at all levels, and definitely strategy, you know, where are we actually going to tailor? You know, it's limited resources. It's often public resources. So there's a sort of an ethical responsibility to involve the consumer and community more widely in where that public money is going. So yes, at your individual level, but at all levels through the organisation, steering committees, advisory committees.
I'll just follow that up in saying institutes and universities. I think I made a big point about that in my talk, but it is, I think, essential that institutes and universities are providing support for researchers to engage with consumers, because it isn't easy to do. And having someone or a strategy in place or a program or someone employed to assist with that has expertise, I think is really important for supporting researchers to do appropriate and valuable research and to engage effectively and sustainably and appropriately with consumers long term.
Catherine and Sarah, I'm mindful that we've come up to 2 o'clock, and I just wanted to thank you so much for your engaging presentation. There's been so many positive comments through the chat. We haven't got to every question that's been raised, so what we'll try and do is pick up some of those in the summary that we send out afterwards, and we will circulate a link to the recording as well for everybody to go back to and listen to another time, and we'll try and address some of the questions in that summary as well. But thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We greatly appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who joined our webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.